Diplomats from Europe, the Middle East, and the U.S. met in Geneva today to iron out a resolution that would establish an international inquiry into atrocities in Yemen. Saudi Arabia and its allies are aligned with one faction of Yemen's civil war. They stand accused of causing massive civilian casualties amid a punishing bombing campaign with American support. The Saudis deny this, and they say the time is not right for an international probe. Meanwhile, in Yemen, a disastrous humanitarian situation continues to deteriorate. William Brangham has that.
Yemen has been torn apart by a 2-year-old civil war as a coalition led by Saudi Arabia fight against Houthi rebels and their allies. Over 10,000 people have died, more than 40,000 have been injured, and over 3 million are malnourished. On top of it all, an outbreak of cholera has killed 2,000 people since late April, and 700,000 people currently are infected. For more on all of this, I'm joined now by Jamie McGoldrick. He's the United Nations humanitarian coordinator in Yemen. Welcome to the NewsHour. Can you just give us a snapshot of how the humanitarian situation is in Yemen right now?
Well, after 2.5 years of war, you see things collapsing. The economy's collapsed, the conflict's raging, obviously, and people are facing a number of threats. The most recent one you just mentioned is cholera, where you've got some 700,000 people who've been affected by it, and over 2,000 people dead. Those numbers will go up to the end of the year to 850,000. And then it will peter out and it'll disappear for a few months and it'll come back again because the conditions are in place. And the conditions are people can't afford to buy clean water, feed their families properly, and the fact that they have very little resilience anymore. And that's what's causing these outbreaks. And the lack of systems for health to treat the people is one of the big factors.
So is it an infrastructure? Is it water? Is it food? I mean, what is driving cholera in particular?
Well, it's a combination of that. I mean, the water sanitation systems have collapsed. They've been struck by airstrikes or they've been bombed, and they no longer function. There's cross-contamination between water supply and, the other parts of it, sewage. And at the same time, people who, after 2 years of war, are very weak nutritionally, very weak health-wise. And so it takes up very quickly as a disease and then affects people very quickly, as we saw.
You mentioned this issue of food. I understand that shipments of food and other aid have been hard to get into the country. Is there enough food to feed people who need the food now?
Well, there are two things. I mean, food is getting into the country, but not in the numbers that we need because the ports like Hodeidah are being restricted in terms of movements, and bringing food around other parts of the country is quite a challenge. But the other big issue is that people can't afford to buy food. I mean, people's purchasing power is diminished, but 80% of the population are actually less well off than they were 2 years ago. And there's one person out of every 4 who has no purchasing power. And what that means is that, like tomorrow, there are 7 million people who can't tell you how they'll feed their families tomorrow. That's how desperate the thing is.
Would you put that as the greatest challenge among the challenges, the many that you face? What is the greatest one?
Well, the greatest challenge is to get media attention and get the world's attention to the suffering of Yemen. I mean, it's been going on for too long now, and the results of it, the numbers are incredulous, where you've got 20 million people out of a population of 27 million who need some sort of assistance, and 10 million of those are in real acute need, starving, not able to feed their families, no access to healthcare, no access to clean water. And it's just a recipe for further and more desperate, catastrophic humanitarian situation.
I mean, obviously, it's got to be very difficult, too, with active fighting going on to try to deliver humanitarian aid. Are the combatants getting in the way of you doing your job?
Well, they do in any conflict. I mean, they are there to restrict access and movement, and we find that from all sides who don't understand what their obligations are, which are that we're supposed to have unfettered access to populations in need. But we're often instrumentalized by the parties, and they use us as part of the war effort. And that happens with imports, it happens with moving people around, it happens with getting visas even. And so they try to control how we work.
There was a recent UN report that said that the Saudi airstrikes had been largely responsible for the civilian deaths, including the deaths of children. What have you seen on the ground? You live there, you are there all the time. The impact of those Saudi airstrikes on the civilians?
Well, I think like in any conflict, and this one in particular, is that the civilian population who have got no skin in this game, they're the ones who suffer most. And a combination of airstrikes, a combination of bombing and fighting, all sides have been guilty of what is taking place, international humanitarian law violations. And the protection that should be afforded to civilians and civilian infrastructure has been absent in this crisis.
You said that both sides in this fight are to blame for some of the casualties here, but how would you apportion blame? The civil war versus the Saudi bombing here as far as the destruction that you've seen?
Well, the physical destruction has mostly been done by the coalition because they've got the aircraft. There's a lot of other destruction taking place because of bombing and shelling and local fighting that takes place as well. There's no side in this crisis is innocent. There's no good guys in this fight. The only people who are in this fight who are suffering are the average citizen of Yemen who really doesn't have any control over how this turns out.
Have you appealed yourself to the Saudis to say, please be a little more discreet in your bombing campaigns. Try to ease up on the civilian population.
We every time there's an incident, every time we have a problem, we ask all the parties to the conflict to recognise that under the Geneva Conventions, international humanitarian law, they have responsibilities, and the responsibilities are to protect civilians and avoid the sort of damage that takes place to structure and to people's lives. Unfortunately, one of the features of this crisis has been almost a blatant disregard by the parties to their obligations under humanitarian law.
I mean, as you well know, the Saudis have also been very resistant to any investigation into their actions in Yemen. How is this conflict ever going to come to an end? How are you ever going to really be able to help the people fully there if one of the main belligerents seems to have no constraint on its actions?
Well, I think there are two things. The investigation should happen whenever there's an incident of any kind, regardless of who is alleged to have taken it. And right now, we would call for any investigation into any action on any side that takes place. The way this will stop is for the war to end. There is no military solution to this. There's been no progress made militarily, really, in the last 2.5 years. The only thing is peace. We have to get the political situation back online, because right now, the humanity is suffering because of the lack of politics.
Jamie McGoldrick, thank you very much for being here.
No problem, my pleasure. Thanks a lot for having me.